The official story says ancient civilization was built by kings, priests, armies, and respectable merchants exchanging grain, bronze, silk, incense, and the occasional politely taxed amphora. Comforting. Today we open 10 case files on the black markets of the ancient world, where smuggling, forgery, tomb robbery, piracy, monopoly abuse, and sacred resale kept the marble machinery moving. The first 9 files expose how states created the crimes they condemned. But the final file, A Licensed Port in Egypt, reveals the colder paradox. Illegality begins the moment power defines the legal door. Chapter 1. The tomb is a warehouse. Egypt's dead, enter the resale economy. Case file number 1. You stand on the west bank of Thebes, where the cliffs are cut with doors for the dead, and the living have been told to behave themselves around eternity. The desert is dry, the tomb passages are dark, and somewhere beneath the limestone, a royal corpse is surrounded by gold, linen, amulets, furniture, ritual vessels, and the fragile administrative fantasy that wealth becomes untouchable once priests say the correct words over it. It does not. A workman from Deir el-Medina knows this better than anyone. He has spent his life serving royal immortality with trained hands. He understands tunnels, blocking stones, plaster seams, burial chambers, guard routines, and the soft moral flexibility that appears when wages fail and officials look nervous. He was hired to build eternity. Now eternity is sitting behind stone, conveniently compact, unusually portable, and apparently underinsured. If this anomaly is verified, then the clean textbook image of sacred Egypt must be rewritten from ceremonial order into something colder, a state where the afterlife itself entered the resale economy. The official file is the Abbot Papyrus, now British Museum EA10221, a legal document from year 16 of Ramesses IX in the late 20th dynasty, around the 12th century BCE. The investigation records a 4-day sequence from days 18 to 21 of the 3rd month of Akhet. The preserved papyrus section is listed at approximately 42, 6 centimeters high and 69.1 centimeters wide. It belongs to a wider documentary environment that includes Papyrus Mayere and the Leopold II Amherst material, meaning this is not one lonely complaint from a frightened clerk with excellent handwriting. It is a paper trail. The human machinery behind the file is almost too modern to be comfortable. Pacer, mayor of the East Bank of Thebes, accuses the administration of the West Bank. Pawero, mayor of the West Bank, has every reason to make the accusations disappear into procedural fog. Vizier Kamwaset steps in as the institutional investigator, because nothing says stable civilization like a sacred security breach requiring senior management review. The usual explanation is simple. Tomb robbers robbed tombs. Hungry men took gold from dead kings. Society declined. Morality collapsed. Please turn the page and admire the funerary mask. That explanation is tidy. Unfortunately, the documents are not. They show inspections, named officials, legal testimony, rival jurisdictions, accusations, counter-accusations, and the bureaucratic classification of violated tombs. Random criminals with torches do not usually generate multi-document legal archives. A lone thief with a shovel does not usually become the center of a political contest between municipal officials. This was not just a grave robbery. This was a security failure inside sacred real estate. The contradiction is brutal because the tombs were not merely graves. They were state projects. They absorbed skilled labor, royal wealth, priestly authority, logistical planning, and theological legitimacy. Pharaohs did not build tombs because they enjoyed interior design in narrow underground corridors. They built them because royal death had to remain politically useful. A protected tomb proved that the king's body, name, and cosmic status remained intact. A violated tomb whispered the opposite. And whispers are dangerous when the dynasty is already weak. The people most capable of violating the tombs were not foreign raiders wandering in from the desert with optimistic chisels. They were insiders or insider-adjacent workers, craftsmen, guards, necropolis personnel, men who knew the geography of the dead better than most officials knew the geography of their own offices. The same labor system that constructed royal immortality had produced the technical class capable of dismantling it. Very efficient, catastrophically efficient. By the reign of Ramesses IX, the new kingdom's authority was thinning. The village of Deir el-Medina had already experienced labor unrest under earlier kings, including the famous strikes under Ramesses III, when workers protested delayed rations. Once a system teaches craftsmen that the state can fail to pay them, the sacred aura around state property becomes less dazzling. Hunger has poor respect for metaphysics. The engineering was not impossible because the Egyptians lacked skill. It was impossible because the state expected a technical workforce to preserve a secret forever while leaving them close to the treasure, dependent on unstable payment, and surrounded by officials whose own loyalties were not exactly carved in granite. Tomb protection required perfect discipline across generations. The tomb robbers needed only one weak link, one map, one corrupt guard, one desperate artisan, one night where eternity had a staffing problem. The political layer is even uglier. If tomb robbery was admitted as systemic, then the crime was not merely theft, it was evidence of administrative decay. Poero's West Bank jurisdiction could be exposed as incompetent or compromised. Pazer could weaponize that exposure against a rival. Chemoset had to investigate without accidentally declaring that royal sanctity had become inventory with poor supervision. The state could punish thieves. Punishing the structure that produced them was less convenient, so the story becomes moral failure. Thieves are greedy. Workers are corrupt. Society is declining. The dead have been dishonored by bad men. This is a useful story because it keeps the institution clean. It does not ask why skilled workers were vulnerable to theft networks. It does not ask how sacred goods could move into resale channels. It does not ask who bought the gold after it left the tomb. It does not ask whether officials took cuts, ignored warnings, redirected accusations, or discovered morality only after the audit became public. The afterlife had become an asset class. Naturally, the paperwork preferred another phrase. The courtroom defense of the mainstream narrative would sound reasonable. Tomb robbery happened because Egypt weakened. Criminals became desperate. Sacred traditions lost authority. The royal tombs, once secure, became targets for looters during political and economic decline. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the math completely breaks down, because decline alone does not explain technical access. Desperation alone does not explain legal archives. Moral decay alone does not explain administrative rivalry. A starving man may steal bread. He does not automatically know where a sealed royal burial chamber is, how to enter it, how to strip precious materials, how to move them, whom to sell them to, and how to survive long enough for his case to become a written investigation. That requires a market, not necessarily a market with signs, stalls, and polite customer service. More likely a chain of handlers, metal recyclers, corrupt intermediaries, quiet buyers, and officials who understood that sacred gold becomes less sacred once melted. The gods may object. Goldsmiths are practical people. There are several cautious possibilities. The first is insider theft driven by unpaid or underpaid labor, where necropolis workers used their professional knowledge to extract value from tombs the state could no longer fully defend. The second is administrative collusion, where officials tolerated or participated in the movement of funerary wealth while blaming lower status thieves when exposure became unavoidable. The third is opportunistic recycling during political fragmentation, where sacred property slowly migrated into secular circulation under the pressure of economic failure. None of these possibilities makes the scene simpler. They make it more human. Who truly robbed the tombs, the men who cut into the chambers, the officials who failed to guard them, or the state that filled the desert with concentrated wealth while neglecting the living hands that protected it? When gold dedicated to a dead king re-enters circulation, is that theft, survival, sacrilege, or an unofficial correction in a broken wage economy? And if royal immortality required secrecy, labor, police power, and paperwork, how divine was it after the locks failed? The tombs of Thebes reveal the first rule of ancient black markets. Illegality often begins exactly where official value is most sacred. The more untouchable an object becomes, the more profitable it is when someone finally touches it. Egypt turned dead kings into guarded treasure. The underground economy turned guarded treasure into merchandise. And once a civilization learns to process sacred bodies as hidden wealth, it is not a long walk to the next case where the cargo is no longer gold, linen, or amulets. It is people. Chapter 2. Delos, the island that processed human beings like cargo. The second entry in the archive begins on Delos, and you stand near the harbor while the Aegean shines with the clean blue innocence that travel brochures still find useful. Ships arrive under hard sunlight. Ropes tighten, planks drop. Men with ledgers watch bodies come ashore. Some bodies walk, some are pushed. Some are inspected with the brisk efficiency normally reserved for livestock, timber, or amphorae that at least had the dignity of not understanding paperwork. A Cilician pirate captain has brought his cargo from the unstable edges of the Mediterranean. A Roman buyer waits with plantation arithmetic in his head. Somewhere in the machinery of power, Pompey the Great is not yet the savior of maritime order. Only a politician watching a crisis become large enough to justify extraordinary command. And in one sharp aristocratic anecdote, a young Julius Caesar is kidnapped by pirates. He survives, jokes with them, threatens to crucify them, then reportedly does exactly that after his release. For a brief moment, a Roman elite experiences the insecurity that normally processed the powerless. Rome found piracy much less amusing when piracy touched the expensive class. If this anomaly is verified, then Mediterranean piracy cannot be filed as mere disorder outside civilization. It becomes supply infrastructure. The black market was not attacking the official economy from the shadows. It was feeding it. The island is Delos, a sacred Aegean site transformed into one of the ancient world's most notorious slave markets. Strabo reports that Delos could admit and send away 10,000 enslaved people in a single day. Rome had made Delos a free port in the 2nd century BCE. The Lex Gabinia of 67 BCE granted Pompey extraordinary command against piracy. Ancient accounts present his campaign as astonishingly rapid, often compressed into roughly 3 months. Roman sources attach vast force figures to that command. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of troops, and enough official urgency to suggest that piracy had stopped being a colorful nuisance and become a strategic embarrassment. 10,000 human beings in a day is not a market stall. It is a logistical organism. The physical contradiction is simple. Textbooks often isolate pirates as criminals disrupting trade, but Delos shows a darker arrangement. Piracy supplied captives, merchants processed them, Roman buyers absorbed them, and estates turned them into agricultural output. The illegal edge and the legal center were not opposites. They were business partners with different stationery. This is where the engineering becomes obscene. Moving enslaved people across the Mediterranean required ships, ports, brokers, interpreters, guards, storage, food, credit, resale networks, and buyers who trusted the market enough to arrive with money. A pirate raid alone does not create a slave economy. Demand does. The captives had to be captured, transported, priced, inspected, purchased, redistributed, and put to work. Every stage required someone to look at a human being and convert terror into margin. Very civilized. Rome's expansion made the demand enormous. Conquest produced captives. Plantation agriculture needed labor. Elite wealth turned land into production zones. The more Rome conquered, the more estates grew. The more estates grew, the more labor they demanded. The more labor they demanded, the more profitable the human supply chain became. Pirates did not invent Roman slavery. They exploited a market that Roman power had made structurally hungry. The political hypocrisy is almost architectural. Rome condemned pirates when they threatened grain routes, shipping lanes, and the safety of aristocrats. Yet for decades, the same Mediterranean instability helped deliver enslaved labor into Roman hands. The empire did not object to human commodification. It objected to unauthorized entrepreneurs interrupting the grain schedule. Pompey's command in 67 BCE reveals the state's real threshold for moral action. Piracy became intolerable when it began to threaten logistics, food supply, public order, and senatorial confidence. Before that, pirates were brutal, yes, but they were also useful. The captives they generated could vanish into legal ownership. Once a body passed through a market like Delos, violence acquired receipts. Who feared the suppression of piracy? Not in public, of course. Public morality wears clean clothes. But the losers would have included brokers, shippers, intermediaries, plantation owners who preferred cheap labor, and local powers profiting from instability. The winners were Roman commanders, central authorities, and elites who wanted the same slave system delivered more safely, more predictably, and preferably without pirates kidnapping future dictators. The erasure is accomplished through vocabulary. Rome becomes civilization. Pirates become criminals. The plantation becomes agriculture. The captive becomes property. The market becomes commerce. The violence that began at sea is sanitized once it enters a ledger. Apparently, morality improves dramatically when accompanied by documentation. The orthodox textbook explanation can now enter the courtroom. Piracy was a lawless menace. Pompey defeated it. Mediterranean order was restored. Rome protected trade, disciplined criminals, and secured the sea. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the supply chain walks into the room wearing chains. Because if piracy was merely external disorder, why did slave markets thrive in connection with it? If Rome was only suppressing criminality, why did it tolerate the demand that made captive taking profitable? If Pompey saved civilization, which civilization exactly was being saved? The victims of enslavement, or the buyers who preferred their human inventory delivered without maritime disruption? The official story wants pirates on one side and Rome on the other. The evidence suggests a more uncomfortable shape. Rome and piracy were not identical, but they were entangled. The state condemned the freelance violence after benefiting from the market conditions that rewarded it. Several cautious hypotheses follow. First, piracy functioned as an unofficial capture mechanism for a Roman labor economy that preferred not to discuss its suppliers too closely. Second, Delos operated as a laundering point, where people taken through violence could be transformed into legally recognized commodities. Third, Pompey's anti-pirate campaign may represent less a moral awakening than a centralization of violence, replacing chaotic private predation with a more state-friendly order. The pirates were bad. This is not difficult. The problem is that their badness was useful until it became inconvenient. What does it say about an empire when the crime is not selling human beings, but selling them without permission? Where does the black market end when the legal market is waiting at the dock? And how many ancient security campaigns were really attempts to discipline unauthorized suppliers while preserving the demand that created them? Delos gives us the second rule of ancient black markets. The official economy often needed the very criminals it publicly despised. The pirate was the scandal. The buyer was the citizen. The island was the filter that converted screams into stock. From tombs, we moved to bodies. From sacred gold to human cargo. But any market that can price a person must first believe that symbols, seals, and official recognition can transform violence into value. Rome understood this perfectly. It stamped authority onto flesh through law. Then it stamped authority onto metal. Chapter 3, The Coin That Lied. Fures and the Underground Mint. The third anomaly on our list fits between two fingers. You stand in a Roman market while a soldier holds out his pay, a merchant narrows his eyes, and a money changer reaches for a blade. The coin looks correct. The portrait is there. The legend is there. The shine is persuasive enough to survive casual optimism. Then the knife bites the edge. Silver opens into something darker underneath. A denarius has just confessed. The soldier's face changes first. He was paid in authority, or so he thought. The merchant now wonders how much fake value has already passed through his hands. The money changer has seen this trick before. A plated coin, a fure, a small metallic lie wearing the costume of public trust. Somewhere behind it stands an anonymous counterfeiter with dyes, base metal, a thin precious surface, and a very practical understanding of human confidence. If this anomaly is verified, then ancient money cannot be dismissed as primitive metal exchange. It was a legal, symbolic, metallurgical, and psychological system sophisticated enough to create financial crime. Civilization, once again, proves its maturity by inventing fraud. The official object is the fore, a counterfeit coin with a base metal core plated in silver or gold to imitate legitimate precious metal currency. Roman law understood the danger. The Lex Cornelia de Falsis associated with Sulla around 81 BCE belongs to a legal tradition treating forgery and false coinage as crimes against public trust. Museum collections, including the British Museum, identify ancient forged denarii directly as forgery, not as charming craft experiments by enthusiastic amateurs. Detection methods included test cuts, banker's marks, visual inspection, and attention to breaks in the plating. Periods of coin shortage and monetary stress, including the social war from 91 to 87 BCE and later imperial crises, increased the incentive to make value where the state had failed to provide enough of it. The data is small, but the system behind it is large. A coin carried weight, metal content, legal authority, public imagery, and market confidence. Its surface could present silver. Its interior could be copper or another cheaper alloy. A test cut could expose the fraud in seconds. Banker's marks could turn suspicion into a visible scar. A false coin could travel silently from soldier to tavern to merchant, from merchant to tax collector, each person hoping not to be the final fool holding the emperor's counterfeit face. That is the physical contradiction. The coin is both object and statement. Its metal says one thing, its stamp says another. The market has to decide which voice to believe. The engineering was not impossible because ancient people lacked metallurgy. It was difficult because counterfeiting required a precise overlap of technical knowledge and social intuition. The forger had to acquire dyes or create convincing substitutes. He had to plate base metal thinly enough to profit, but convincingly enough to pass inspection. He had to imitate official weight, shape, imagery, and wear. He had to understand not only metal, but hesitation. A fake coin works only when the victim is too busy, too trusting, too poor, too tired, or too afraid to challenge the transaction. In other words, the counterfeiter was not attacking silver. He was attacking time. The deeper contradiction is political. Coinage was never just money. It was portable sovereignty. The state stamped authority into metal and sent it through the hands of soldiers, merchants, taxpayers, and subjects. A ruler's portrait on a coin announced that power could be touched, counted, owed, paid, hoarded, and believed. Every transaction became a small referendum on imperial credibility, which is exactly why counterfeiting was so threatening. The false coin did not need to destroy the economy. It only needed to imitate the emperor well enough for the market to hesitate. One successful forgery is a nuisance. Many successful forgeries become a rumor. Enough rumors become a monetary disease. Suddenly, every coin requires examination. Every payment becomes negotiation. Every portrait becomes suspect. The state's sacred right to define value begins to look disturbingly copyable. This is the nightmare inside Roman counterfeiting. Public authority can be forged by private hands. The threatened parties were obvious. The mint monopoly was threatened because unauthorized coinage challenged the state's control over value. Tax collection was threatened because revenue becomes uncertain if payment cannot be trusted. Military payment was threatened because soldiers do not enjoy discovering that their loyalty has been compensated in plated disappointment. Merchants were threatened because they stood at the front line of circulation, absorbing risk coin by coin. But the state's deeper fear was symbolic. A counterfeiter copied not only metal, but legitimacy. He borrowed the face of the ruler, reproduced the signs of public order, and inserted private fraud into official circulation. Bad ethics, good branding. The legal language frames this as fraud, and fairly so. But beneath the legal category is a much older anxiety. If value depends on recognition, then anyone who can counterfeit recognition can interfere with power. The orthodox textbook explanation now enters calmly, wearing a respectable toga. Ancient economies used coins because coins were useful. Some criminals made fake coins. The state punished them. This shows normal law enforcement in a developing monetary world. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the coin is cut open. Because the foray is not a footnote to ancient money, it is proof of how complex ancient money already was. A simple barter economy does not require anti-counterfeiting law. A village swapping goats does not produce plated denarii, banker's marks, test cuts, legal doctrine on forgery, and public anxiety over metal trust. Nobody test cuts a turnip. The fake coin exposes the whole operating system. It shows that value was layered. Intrinsic metal, official stamp, public confidence, and enforced legality. It shows that markets could be fooled because markets were already abstract. It shows that the state depended on belief while pretending belief was metal. Several cautious hypotheses can stand beside the orthodox view. First, counterfeit coinage may have expanded during shortages because ordinary transactions required coin supply that official mints could not always satisfy. Second, some forays may reflect organized criminal production, not isolated petty fraud, because imitation at scale requires equipment, distribution, and repeatable technique. Third, public detection practices like cuts and marks suggest a market culture trained to manage monetary risk from below, not merely a passive population waiting for state protection. The money changer's blade is therefore more than a tool. It is a private audit. Who owns value? The state that stamps the coin, the market that accepts it, or the metal hidden inside it? If a plated denarius circulates successfully for years, is its fraud located in the coin? Or in the moment someone finally loses confidence? And when the emperor's face can be copied by an underground mint, how much of imperial power was metal? And how much was theater with a very serious treasury department? The foray gives us the third rule of ancient black markets. The more abstract a system becomes, the more profitable it is to counterfeit the symbols that hold it together. Rome trusted coins because they bore authority. Forgers trusted Rome because authority had a recognizable design. From human bodies on Delos, we arrive at metal bodies in Roman hands. In both cases, legality performs the transformation. A captive becomes property when the market agrees. Base metal becomes money when the stamp is believed. But not every underground economy forged value by imitation. Some simply avoided the moment when the state reached for its percentage. So we leave the cut coin on the money changer's table and follow the next trail toward the Red Sea, where pepper, ivory, aromatics, and Roman customs law meet the most ancient temptation in trade, moving expensive goods past the official hand before it closes. Chapter 4. The Quarter Tax Road, Pepper, Ivory, and Smuggling Around the Red Sea. Our fourth stop breaks the map at the Red Sea. You stand in the heat near a desert road that runs between ports, customs stations, warehouses, and the long bureaucratic shadow of Alexandria. A ship has come in from the Indian Ocean. Its cargo smells of pepper, resin, damp rope, animal hide, and profit. The merchant behind the Muziris papyrus is not a romantic adventurer chasing spices for the glory of cultural exchange. He is a man surrounded by credit risk, customs assessments, maritime danger, and the beautiful Roman discovery that luxury becomes more respectable when the state takes a quarter of it. His ship, the Hermopolitan, has crossed the sea from the world of South Indian ports into Roman Egypt, carrying goods that are light enough to move and valuable enough to make everyone nearby suddenly interested in procedure. A customs official waits near the fiscal machine. A caravan handler watches from the edge of the route, already knowing which crates are counted, which seals matter, which men can be bribed, and where the desert is wide enough for merchandise to develop a temporary memory problem. If this anomaly is verified, then Indo-Roman trade was not a graceful exchange of exotic goods between curious civilizations. It was a high-value customs environment where the legal channel was so profitable for the state that the illegal channel became mathematically irresistible. The key document is the Muziris papyrus, a mid-2nd century CE record preserving a loan agreement and fiscal assessment for cargo moving from South India into Roman Egypt. It names the ship Hermopolitan. The goods include luxury commodities such as ivory, textiles, aromatics, and related high-value imports. Roman Egypt applied the tetart, a quarter tax of 25% on certain external trade. Strabo says that as many as 120 ships sailed from Myos Hormos toward India in the early Roman period. The route connected Indian Ocean ports, Red Sea harbors, desert roads, Nile transport, and customs offices tied to Alexandria. That is not spice drifting westward through a vague ancient haze. That is international trade with financing, risk allocation, warehousing, taxation, and enough paperwork to make a modern logistics department feel briefly ancestral. The physical contradiction is obvious. The more official the trade became, the stronger the incentive to escape official visibility. A 25% tax is not a small administrative gesture. It is the state placing a hand inside the cargo hold and removing 1/4 of the value before the merchant can breathe normally. On low-value goods, that might be annoying. On ivory, aromatics, fine textiles, pepper, pearls, and luxury cargo, it becomes a business model for discretion. The engineering of this trade was not primitive. A merchant had to finance the voyage before profit existed. Ships had to time the monsoon. Goods had to survive distance, humidity, theft, storms, spoilage, port fees, desert transport, and the possibility that officials might become unusually literate at the exact wrong moment. The cargo then moved from Red Sea ports through the eastern desert by caravan, across roads where water, guards, animals, and labor determined whether profit reached the Nile or died under the sun. That complexity created opportunities. Every transfer point was a leak, a dock was a leak, a warehouse was a leak, a customs inspection was a leak, a desert caravan was a leak with hooves. If the state built a corridor to capture revenue, smugglers studied the corridor as carefully as engineers. The official road and the black market road were often the same road, separated by timing, silence, and the number of amphorae that appeared on the list. Rome's politics made the hypocrisy useful. Elite writers could complain about Eastern luxuries draining Roman morals and money. The state, meanwhile, taxed the same luxuries with a discipline suggesting that moral anxiety becomes much easier to tolerate at 25%. Pepper was decadent. Ivory was dangerous. Aromatics were corrupting. Also, please declare them at the warehouse. The power layer is not only commerce, it is fiscal extraction. Roman control over Egypt gave the empire access to grain, ports, river systems, desert roads, and Red Sea connections. Protecting trade routes was not an act of innocent globalization. It was revenue defense. The customs official did not stand at the warehouse because Rome loved transparency. He stood there because taxable luxury was moving through imperial space. Who feared evasion? The state, obviously, because smuggling reduced revenue. Licensed merchants, because competitors avoiding the tetart could undercut them. Officials, because visible leakage suggested corruption or weakness. But who benefited? Caravan handlers, port workers, middlemen, ship captains, local elites, bribed inspectors, and any merchant capable of turning geography into a tax strategy. This is where the erasure begins. Later history remembers the Indo-Roman trade as spices, silk, ivory, and cultural contact. That is not false. It is merely incomplete in the way a tax form is incomplete if it leaves out income. The official memory prefers exchange. The documents reveal assessment. And assessment creates evasion, because merchants are ancient humans, not devotional statues of compliance. The courtroom version of the textbook story is polished and harmless. Roman merchants sailed east for spices. India and Rome exchanged goods. Luxury trade enriched both worlds. The Red Sea became a bridge between civilizations. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the quarter tax enters the cabin and sits down. Because once a state takes 25%, the route is no longer just a bridge, it is a fiscal trap with sails. A merchant facing that level of extraction does not merely ask, "How do I trade?" He asks, "How much of my trade must become visible, and to whom?" The question is not whether smuggling existed in such an environment. The question is how anyone expected it not to. There are cautious possibilities. First, merchants may have underdeclared cargo, disguising quantity, quality, origin, or value before assessment. Second, goods may have been diverted during desert transport, where distance from major customs centers allowed selective disappearance. Third, official corruption may have blurred the difference between smuggling and negotiated taxation, because nothing softens fiscal law like an inspector with private expenses. None of this requires imagining cartoon criminals sneaking pepper past Rome in tiny suspicious bags. The more likely reality is quieter. Altered lists, friendly valuations, missing bundles, unofficial side cargo, and agreements that were never meant to survive on papyrus. Ancient fraud, like modern fraud, often wears sandals and uses accounting. What does a tax become when everyone knows it is high enough to invite evasion? Is smuggling a crime against order, or the predictable shadow of a state that priced honesty too aggressively? And when Rome condemned luxury while profiting from its movement, was morality a principle, or just a speech delivered after customs revenue was secured? The Red Sea trade gives us the fourth rule of ancient black markets. Taxation does not simply collect from commerce. It designs the shape of evasion. The state drew the official route from ocean to warehouse. The merchant studied the same route and saw hidden doors. From forged coins, we followed value into cargo. From metal lies to declared goods. But the logic keeps narrowing. If Rome taxed luxury because luxury was profitable, another ancient state went further. It did not wait for merchants to bring value across the sea. It seized the basic materials of survival itself and then acted surprised when unofficial markets began to breathe around the monopoly. The road now turns east, away from pepper and ivory, towards salt, iron, and the cold administrative dream of taxing necessity. Chapter 5. Salt and Iron, the state that taxed survival. We open the fifth folder in the dark, and you are standing beside a salt pan under the Han sun. The ground is white, the air is bitter, and the work is not poetic. Salt clings to skin. Iron waits in furnaces. Neither commodity flatters civilization with beauty. They are too useful for that. A private producer watches officials approach the industry that once made families wealthy and communities self-sufficient. His product is not perfume, purple cloth, or imported ivory. It is preservation, cooking, medicine, livestock care, and survival. Nearby, iron means plows, knives, tools, weapons, nails, fittings, and the hard edge of agricultural life. Then the state discovers both. A powerful fiscal official, Sang Hongyang, stands on the side of intervention. Behind him is the long military ambition of Emperor Wu of Han. In 81 BCE, under Emperor Zhao, Confucian scholars are summoned to debate the policy that has already changed the economy: state monopolies over salt and iron. The moral language is refined. The practical reality is not. When government controls what everyone needs, daily life becomes a revenue stream with a legal department. If this anomaly is verified, then ancient black markets were not only about luxury, greed, or criminal appetite. They were also born from necessity. The state did not merely police crime, it manufactured illegal trade by monopolizing survival. The official framework belongs to Han China. Emperor Wu ruled from 141 to 87 BCE. State monopolies on salt and iron were established in the late 2nd century BCE, commonly dated around 119 to 117 BCE. The famous salt and iron debate occurred in 81 BCE, bringing government officials and Confucian critics into formal argument over monopolies, fiscal policy, military expenditure, merchant power, and the burden placed on ordinary households. Emperor Wu's wider reforms also included state control over coinage and policies aimed at stabilizing markets. The numbers are not the only evidence. The category matters more. Salt and iron are not optional. Salt preserves food in a world without refrigeration. Iron equips farmers, soldiers, builders, and households. To monopolize them is not to regulate decoration. It is to place the state's hand on the throat of ordinary life and call the gesture stability. very stable, especially for the hand. The physical contradiction is severe. A monopoly is easiest to justify when officials describe it as public order. Quality improves, prices stabilize. Greedy merchants are restrained, the people are protected. The border armies are funded, the realm becomes secure. The documents sound noble enough, provided no one asks why the most morally urgent commodities always happen to be the most profitable ones. The engineering of control required reach. Salt production depended on extraction sites, boiling, evaporation, transport, storage, and distribution. Iron production required ore, fuel, furnaces, skilled labor, casting or forging, and movement into agricultural and military networks. A state monopoly had to supervise production, replace or absorb private operators, set prices, manage supply, prevent leakage, and punish unofficial trade. This is difficult even for a strong bureaucracy. For a large agrarian empire, it becomes a constant war against geography, necessity, and human resentment. And resentment has excellent logistics. If people need salt every day, someone will supply salt outside official channels when the price is too high, the quality too low, the distance too great, or the officials too corrupt. If farmers need iron tools, they do not pause harvest cycles out of admiration for fiscal theory. Survival commodities create markets because survival does not wait patiently for authorized distribution. The impossible part is not that black markets formed. The impossible part is believing they would not. Sang Hongyang's defense rested on state necessity. Emperor Wu's campaigns, especially frontier wars and expansionist policies, required revenue. Private merchants had accumulated dangerous wealth. Monopolies could fund defense, weaken rival economic power, and centralize control. To an administrator, salt and iron were not merely goods, they were levers. Pull them correctly, and the empire paid for itself. To Confucian critics, this was precisely the problem. The state, in their view, had become too hungry, too commercial, too willing to burden the people while dressing extraction in public virtue. Officials accused merchants of greed, but critics saw a government behaving like the largest merchant in the empire, with better prisons. A private salt producer caught in this transformation loses more than business. He loses legal space. Yesterday, he supplied a commodity. Today, he competes with the state. The same activity changes moral category because power has redrawn the boundary around profit. Private production becomes suspicious. Unofficial sale becomes criminal. A necessity becomes a controlled substance, except everyone needs it with breakfast. The political layer is centralization. Salt and iron monopolies funded war, but they also disciplined merchant power. Wealth outside the state has always made rulers uncomfortable. Rich merchants can influence local society, control supply, evade ideology, and make officials feel underdressed. Monopolies solved this with admirable bluntness. Take the industry, accuse the former operators of selfishness, and present fiscal capture as moral correction. Ancient bureaucracy did not discover salt because it loved seasoning. It discovered salt because everyone needs it, which is the dream of every monopoly. The erasure works by moral framing. Private merchants become greedy. State control becomes righteous. Military budgets become public security. Economic dissent becomes ideological disorder. The language of stability covers the machinery of extraction. Once the monopoly exists, resistance can be described as selfishness, rather than protest against a system that has converted daily necessity into imperial finance. The courtroom narrative now takes its seat. The Han state controlled salt and iron to stabilize supply, protect the people from profiteers, ensure quality, fund defense, and prevent private merchants from undermining the realm. The policy may have been harsh, but it served the needs of empire. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the household enters the courtroom carrying an empty salt jar and a broken plow. Because quality control is a charming explanation for seizing the two commodities that preserve food, equip agriculture, arm soldiers, and finance frontier war. Stabilization may have been part of the argument, but monopoly also meant dependence. Once the state controls necessity, the people do not merely buy goods. They buy permission to continue ordinary life at official prices. That is not just economic policy, that is power you can taste. Several cautious hypotheses follow. First, black market salt and iron likely appeared wherever official pricing, distance, corruption, or supply failures made legal access burdensome. Second, unofficial production may have survived through local networks that communities trusted more than distant bureaucracies. Third, the ideological attack on merchants may have helped hide the state's own transformation into the dominant commercial actor. The scholars in 81 BCE were not debating a technical footnote. They were arguing over the moral identity of government. Is the state allowed to behave like a merchant if it claims the revenue funds order? Are private producers greedy when they sell necessity, while officials become virtuous when they monopolize it? And when survival itself is taxed through controlled access, is smuggling a crime, or the breathing pattern of a society pressed too tightly? Salt and iron reveal the fifth rule of ancient black markets. The more essential a commodity is, the more coercive monopoly becomes, and the more rational evasion starts to look. The state called it order. Producers called it dispossession. Households called it Tuesday. From the Red Sea, we saw Rome tax luxury. In Han China, we see the state go deeper, past luxury, past status, past imported desire, into the basic materials of survival. Yet power is never satisfied with necessities alone. It also learns to tax longing, prestige, and the invisible hunger for sacred atmosphere. So the investigation leaves the salt pan and the furnace. The trail dries into desert air, where resin hardens on trees, caravans move between wells, temples wait for fragrance, and smoke rises toward heaven through a supply chain that charged by the mile. Chapter 6. The Incense Desert. Aromatics, toll roads, and religious luxury laundering. The sixth fragment of our investigation sits in the desert, and you are walking beside a Nabatean caravan master as the heat presses down like a tax assessment written by the sun. The camels move slowly. The guards watch the horizon. The wells matter more than speeches. Somewhere far behind the caravan, in southern Arabia, a resin harvester has cut the bark of a tree and waited for sap to harden into fragrance. By the time that resin reaches a temple, it will no longer look like labor, geography, violence, tolls, water rights, elite demand, or monopoly routing. It will look like piety. This is very convenient. A temple buyer waits at the end of the chain. He does not purchase desert logistics. He purchases frankincense, myrrh, sanctity, atmosphere, the correct smell of divine seriousness. Pliny the Elder, watching Rome's appetite for Eastern luxuries, sees an empire capable of turning imported commodities into moral anxiety and ritual necessity at the same time. The gods, apparently, have refined taste. Also, shipping costs. If this anomaly is verified, then ancient incense was not simply a spiritual object drifting through sacred smoke. It was a controlled luxury commodity moving through hard infrastructure, and every prayer that burned it also burned proof of an economic system. The official trade begins with aromatics such as frankincense and myrrh, produced mainly in southern Arabia, Ethiopia, Somalia, and nearby regions. Major routes linked South Arabian production zones with Mediterranean markets such as Gaza. The incense land trade flourished especially from the 3rd century BCE to the 2nd century CE. South Arabian merchants moved not only frankincense and myrrh, but also spices, gold, ivory, pearls, precious stones, and textiles. Nabatean towns, forts, caravan stations, and desert infrastructure in the Negev are tied to the incense and spice routes. Those details matter because they break the perfume. Aromatic resin is light, valuable, divisible, portable, and spiritually marketable. That is nearly the perfect commodity. It can be harvested far away, restricted by geography, moved through controlled corridors, priced by scarcity, sanctified by temples, and consumed by elites who prefer their luxury to arrive wearing theology. The physical contradiction is that sacred smoke begins as a supply chain. The incense that rises in a temple has already passed through trees, harvesters, tribal territories, caravan masters, toll stations, armed escorts, desert forts, wells, port towns, merchants, priests, and buyers. By the time it burns before a god, the commodity has been handled by so many earthly interests that heaven is receiving a heavily processed product. The engineering was not impossible because ancient people could not cross deserts. They could. The impossible part was keeping such a route alive across hostile distance. A caravan needed animals, fodder, water, guards, guides, negotiated passage, storage, market access, and protection from raids. A single failed well could kill profit. A hostile tribe could turn inventory into ransom. A toll gate could convert geography into revenue. A fort could turn survival into administration. The desert did not merely separate markets, it monetized them. Nabatean power makes sense in that environment. Control the stations, the water, the safe passages, the knowledge of movement, and you do not need to own every tree that produces resin. You control the road between the tree and the buyer. That is often better. Production is hard, intermediation is elegant. Intermediation with desert forts is civilization wearing a knife. The politics of incense were wrapped in religion, but not softened by it. Temples needed incense because ritual performance required sensory authority. Smoke marked the separation between ordinary air and sacred space. Elites needed incense because expensive religious consumption could be presented as devotion rather than display. States and merchant powers needed incense because ritual demand created dependable markets. Everyone benefited, except the people doing the hardest work at the biological source of the commodity. The resin harvester cuts the tree. The caravan master risks the road. The temple buyer spiritualizes the purchase. The elite patron receives prestige. The merchant receives margin. The state or local power receives tolls, taxes, or tribute. The god receives smoke, which is the only participant unlikely to complain about price manipulation. Who feared disruption? Arabian kingdoms, Nabatean intermediaries, temple authorities, and luxury merchants all had reasons to defend controlled movement. If alternate routes emerged, prices could weaken. If smugglers bypassed tolls, states lost revenue. If substitutes flooded the market, sacred exclusivity became less impressive. If common households accessed elite aromatics too easily, ritual hierarchy lost some of its scent. The erasure is almost delicate. Later memory keeps the fragrance and loses the toll road. It remembers incense as ritual atmosphere, a cloud of holiness, a cinematic swirl around priests and altars. It forgets guards, wells, forts, scarcity, bargaining, violence, and the fact that every sacred luxury needs someone to carry it through a bad neighborhood. The Orthodox textbook narrative now appears freshly perfumed. Ancient people valued incense for religious reasons. Frankincense and myrrh were burned in temples, used in rituals, and exchanged across long-distance trade routes. These goods connected Arabia, Africa, the Mediterranean, and the wider ancient world. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the caravan bill is opened. Because a spiritual object that requires fortified desert towns, camel logistics, international trade, toll systems, elite pricing, and route control is also a luxury commodity. Calling incense religious is not wrong. It is just suspiciously incomplete. It is like calling a cathedral a building and forgetting the land grants. There are cautious alternatives to the soft focus version. First, incense routes may have functioned as cartel-like corridors, where control over water and passage allowed intermediaries to influence supply and price. Second, temples may have acted as prestige laundering systems, converting elite luxury demand into respectable ritual consumption. Third, smuggling likely followed wherever tolls, monopolies, or restricted access made the official road expensive enough to avoid. The black market here is not always a pirate cove or a secret mint. Sometimes it is a side path around a toll station. Sometimes it is resin moved outside an authorized caravan. Sometimes it is a merchant quietly changing the declared origin, grade, or quantity of a substance that will later be burned before an altar and described as pure devotion. Pure, of course. What happens when worship depends on controlled scarcity? Is a temple still above the market when its sacred atmosphere arrives through taxed, guarded, high-margin trade? And when gods are offered imported fragrance, who is really being honored? The divine, the patron, the merchant, or the political system that controls the road? The Incense Desert gives us the sixth rule of ancient black markets: sacred demand does not cancel economics. It disguises it beautifully. The more divine a commodity appears at the point of consumption, the easier it becomes to forget the human system that made it expensive. From salt and iron, we moved from necessity to sanctity. From the state taxing survival, we reached merchants and temples monetizing devotion. But power does not stop with food, tools, or prayer. It also reaches into the human need to be seen, ranked, feared, and obeyed. So the smoke thins. The desert road bends toward the sea. Shells pile in workshops. Dye stains the hands of workers. A color begins to look less like beauty and more like a border with imperial guards. Chapter 7. Purple. The color that became contraband. Number 7. You stand inside a dye workshop near the sea, and the first thing you notice is not beauty. It is rot. Crushed shells pile in heaps. Vats breathe out a smell that makes holiness seem unlikely. A dyer's hands are stained by labor that looks ugly long before it becomes imperial. He works with marine snails historically associated with murex species, extracting a substance that will become Tyrian purple, the color later draped around emperors, courts, bishops, and people who understood that status should ideally be visible from across a room. An imperial official watches the trade with the seriousness of a border guard. A buyer wants cloth. Not warmth, not modesty. Signal. The emperor understands the danger. A color can become a claim. If this anomaly is verified, then ancient contraband was not limited to weapons, gold, slaves, or smuggled goods. Sometimes the forbidden object was a shade. The timeline taught to our children would need a small but humiliating correction. Empire was occasionally terrified of fabric. The official material is Tyrian purple, produced from marine snails and historically associated with Phoenician tire. Its key pigment compound is 6,6'-dibromoindigo. Phoenician purple production reaches back into the Bronze Age. Roman and Byzantine sumptuary laws increasingly restricted elite purple garments, and in 424 CE Theodosius II tightened legislation against dyeing wool or silk in colors resembling imperial purple. The crime was not merely owning luxury. It was approaching the visual language of sovereignty too closely. That is the contradiction. Purple was expensive, yes. It required specialized knowledge, marine harvesting, unpleasant processing, skilled dyeing, and access to trade. But price alone does not explain the anxiety. If purple were only costly, the market would have handled exclusion efficiently, as markets often do, by being rude to poor people. Instead, the state intervened. It did not merely let wealth filter buyers. It drew a legal boundary around color. Chromatic border control. Very normal behavior for a confident empire. The engineering was difficult from the beginning. The dyer needed shells gathered in huge quantities, careful extraction, controlled exposure, vats, timing, textile knowledge, and enough tolerance for smell to suggest either discipline or damaged judgment. Purple dye did not emerge from a polite jar labeled royalty. It came from biological labor, technical repetition, and workshops that turned sea life into political theater. And because the technique was hard, the people who mastered it became dangerous, not dangerous like generals. Worse, in a symbolic monarchy, dangerous like craftsmen who could manufacture the visual grammar of power. This is the deeper problem. Imperial authority is supposed to feel natural, distant, elevated. The ruler appears in special clothing, special colors, special ceremonies, special rooms, surrounded by controlled signs. The distance is the point. But if a wealthy outsider, ambitious courtier, provincial magnate, or black market buyer can obtain cloth that resembles imperial purple, then distance shrinks. The eye hesitates. The hierarchy flickers. The state feared imitation because imitation collapses symbolic space. A fake coin copies the ruler's face. Unauthorized purple copies the ruler's aura. Who was threatened? The emperor, obviously, because exclusive symbols are never decorative to the people who own them. The court bureaucracy was threatened because rank depends on controlled visibility. Licensed producers and official suppliers were threatened because unauthorized dye weakened monopoly value. Dyers were threatened because their skill could become evidence. A workshop could become a crime scene with vats. The buyer's stake was ambition. In a world where cloth communicates status before speech begins, color becomes political speech worn on the body. Purple did not merely say, "I am wealthy." It could whisper, "I stand near power." Worse, it could suggest, "Perhaps power stands near me." Empires hate whispers. They prefer proclamations, ideally approved. The erasure is soft because fashion is easier to remember than coercion. Later history remembers royal purple as luxury, taste, ceremony, and the obvious fact that important people enjoyed dressing like expensive bruises. It forgets regulation. It forgets surveillance. It forgets dyers, sellers, scraps, substitutes, and laws against resemblance. It forgets that the state did not only control armies and taxes, it controlled what ambition was allowed to look like. The courtroom narrative now enters wearing a tasteful cloak. Purple was rare and expensive, so naturally only rulers and elites wore it. The color became associated with royalty because production was difficult and prices were high. The laws merely reflected existing social hierarchy. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until Theodosius II starts legislating against resemblance. Because if cost alone were enough, law would not need to patrol the shade. If rarity alone protected hierarchy, officials would not care whether wool or silk approached imperial purple. And if the color were only fashion, unauthorized dye would not trigger political anxiety. The empire was not afraid of aesthetics. It was afraid of counterfeit sovereignty. There are cautious alternative readings. First, purple restrictions may have functioned as a visual monopoly, protecting imperial rank in a society where authority depended heavily on public display. Second, unauthorized production and sale likely created contraband channels around dyers, merchants, scraps, imitations, and substitute shades. Third, the tightening of laws against resembling imperial purple suggests that the black market did not need perfect copies. Approximation was threatening enough. The official story calls it luxury regulation. Sure, nothing says relaxed government like criminalizing a suspiciously ambitious tint. What is power when it can be threatened by cloth? If a color must be legally protected, is authority strong or merely well-costumed? And when ordinary people are forbidden from wearing the visible signs of rank, is the state defending order, or admitting that hierarchy is partly a performance maintained by wardrobe control? Purple gives us the seventh rule of ancient black markets. Symbols become contraband when power depends on controlling who may imitate them. A forbidden color is not trivial, it is a confession. The ruler knows the costume matters. From incense, we followed sacred luxury into political visibility. From smoke, we arrive at dye. Both begin in messy material processes and end as elevated meaning. But the investigation now narrows even further. Purple showed that states feared the unauthorized copy of a symbol. The next file shows an empire going after something more valuable than a color, the living biological secret behind an entire luxury industry. The vats cool, the shells rot, the cloth dries into authority. Far to the east, in a quieter container, something smaller than a coin and softer than a thread waits to be smuggled across the world. Chapter 8. The Silkworm Heist, or Biological Smuggling Before Patents. Item number 8 begins inside a hollow cane, and you are watching two monks carry one of the smallest strategic weapons in late antiquity. Not a blade, not a treaty, not a chest of gold. Something quieter. Silkworm eggs. The road is long, the borders are dangerous, and the cargo has the personality of dust. Yet if the story preserved in Byzantine tradition is even broadly true, those hidden eggs will help alter imperial luxury, textile production, diplomacy, and revenue. History often enjoys pretending that great economic shifts arrive with armies and proclamations. Sometimes they arrive inside luggage carried by men who look religious enough to avoid a detailed search. Justinian I waits at the imperial end of the operation. He rules from 527 to 565 CE, and he wants what every ruler wants when facing expensive middlemen: dependence reduced, monopoly captured, prestige secured, and the invoice improved. Between Byzantium and silk stand Eastern producers, Sogdian and Persian intermediaries, guarded knowledge, and the frustrating fact that worms do not naturally respect imperial ambition. If this anomaly is verified, then the spread of silk production was not simply cultural exchange flowing politely across Eurasia. It was biological smuggling. Industrial espionage before patents. Theft with wings still pending. The official tradition places the silkworm smuggling episode in the mid-6th century, often around 552 to 554 CE, though some later traditions use 563 CE. The story is associated with Procopius and later Byzantine silk history. The eggs or larvae were reportedly hidden in hollow canes or similar containers. Justinian's reign runs from 527 to 565 CE. The result was the establishment of Byzantine silk production, followed by imperial control over manufacture. The contraband was not finished silk. It was the living mechanism that made silk possible. That detail changes everything. A bale of silk is a commodity. A silkworm egg is a production system waiting to hatch. Smuggling silk feeds demand. Smuggling silkworms attacks the structure of supply. It bypasses merchants, routes, taxes, secrecy, and diplomacy by stealing the biological source code. The engineering problem was delicate. Silkworms are not metal ingots. They are fragile living organisms tied to mulberry leaves, controlled temperature, breeding cycles, and technical knowledge. Carrying eggs over thousands of kilometers required concealment, timing, survival, and someone at the destination who understood that acquisition was only the beginning. Once the eggs arrived, Byzantium needed feeding systems, breeding knowledge, textile workers, reeling techniques, workshops, and state oversight. Smuggling the worms was dramatic. Keeping them alive was the actual insult to the old monopoly. The deeper paradox is legal and moral. Byzantium was an empire obsessed with law, orthodoxy, ceremony, and the correct classification of nearly everything. Yet when faced with a luxury monopoly beyond its control, it allegedly sponsored the covert removal of biological knowledge from the East. This is not an accusation of modern-style patent violation, because modern patents did not exist. It is something older and perhaps more honest. One power understood that another power's secret was valuable and decided secrecy was less impressive once pierced. Cultural exchange is doing heroic labor in the polite version of this story. The political stakes were enormous. Silk was not just cloth. It was court costume, diplomatic gift, church furnishing, elite marker, ceremonial language, and fiscal opportunity. To control silk production was to control a material that could be converted into prestige at home and leverage abroad. Persian and Central Asian intermediaries benefited from controlling routes and access. Chinese sericulture depended for centuries on protected technical knowledge. Byzantine demand made silk expensive, and expensive materials attract rulers the way blood attracts sharks with better architecture. Who feared the heist? Intermediaries who profited from distance. Rival states that used silk routes as leverage. Merchant networks that preferred Byzantium as a dependent buyer rather than a producer. And perhaps even Byzantine private traders once the state transformed smuggled biology into an imperial industry. Because the final goal was not freedom from monopoly. It was replacement. One monopoly falls. Another one puts on a crown. That is the erasure. Later accounts can celebrate the birth of Byzantine silk as innovation, diffusion, cleverness, and imperial achievement. They are not entirely wrong. But the clean language smooths over the central mechanism. The empire did not merely learn. It acquired what others had protected. Then it converted that acquisition into state-controlled luxury production. Theft becomes policy when it succeeds. Failure would have been espionage. Success becomes civilization. The courtroom narrative now arrives in expensive fabric. Silk production spread through cultural exchange across Eurasia. Knowledge moved gradually along trade routes. Byzantium eventually developed its own silk industry, reducing reliance on Eastern suppliers and enriching Mediterranean craft. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the hollow cane is placed on the evidence table. Because spread naturally is a strange phrase for a story involving monks, concealment, imperial sponsorship, guarded biological material, and a strategic attempt to break intermediary control. The silkworms did not wander west in search of ecumenical dialogue. Someone carried them. Quietly. There are cautious readings. First, the smuggling story may preserve a simplified memory of a broader transfer of sericulture knowledge, compressed into the dramatic image of monks and hidden eggs. Second, Justinian's court likely had strong strategic motives to reduce dependence on Persian-controlled trade channels, especially in a world where luxury supply and diplomacy were entangled. Third, the creation of Byzantine silk production may represent not open cultural sharing, but controlled technological capture followed by imperial monopoly. The exact details may be debated. The structure is not hard to recognize. A protected industry, a dependent buyer, a covert transfer, a new state monopoly. Humans have renamed this process many times. Innovation, diffusion, strategic acquisition, knowledge transfer. The vocabulary improves after victory. What is a secret worth once biology can be moved in a cane? When an empire steals the means of production, is it liberation from foreign monopoly, or the birth of a domestic one? And how many celebrated moments of cultural transmission were, at ground level, operations conducted by people with concealed cargo and very selective honesty? The silkworm heist gives us the eighth rule of ancient black markets, the most valuable. Contraband is not always the luxury object. Sometimes it is the process that makes the luxury possible. Silk was beautiful. The worm was power. From purple, we followed color into controlled status. From silk, we follow living knowledge into controlled production. But every luxury system, every monopoly, every forbidden symbol still depends on something more basic. A population alive enough to buy, work, riot, and obey. So the investigation leaves the hollow cane and returns to Rome, where the most dangerous commodity is not purple cloth, imported resin, forged silver, or even silk. It is bread. Chapter 9. Bread, hoarding, and the Riot Commodity. Rome's grain black market. Number 9. You stand in a bread queue in Rome, and the city around you is too large for its own stomach. The streets are loud, the apartments are crowded, and somewhere beyond the harbor, beyond the warehouses, beyond the merchant ships and official seals, the next shipment of grain is either arriving, delayed, hidden, overpriced, or being discussed by men who understand that hunger becomes politics faster than philosophy. An urban citizen waits for subsidized grain. A merchant watches the market tighten. An official tied to the Annona calculates supply, risk, rumor, and riot. In the background stands Spurius Maelius, the early legendary warning case. A wealthy grain dealer accused of using private food distribution as a staircase toward political power. Whether the story is clean history or political memory sharpened into a blade, Rome understood the message. Bread is never just bread when the crowd is counting loaves. If this anomaly is verified, then Rome's grain black market was not petty food crime. It was the exposed nerve of an empire whose capital depended on supply chains so vast, fragile, and politically explosive that a hoarded sack could become a threat to public order. The official data is stark. Imperial Rome's population is commonly estimated near 1 million by the 2nd century CE. Around 200,000 adult male citizens received subsidized or free grain through the grain dole. The city relied heavily on imported grain from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. Modern estimates suggest that thousands of merchant voyages per year were required to sustain the capital's supply. Roman law, including the Lex Julia de Annona, targeted actions that manipulated, obstructed, or endangered the grain supply. Those numbers removed the comedy from bread and circuses. Feeding Rome was not a casual handout to lazy citizens, as later moralists and lazy summaries prefer to imply. It was a logistical hostage situation in which the hostage was the capital city. No railways, no refrigeration, no digital inventory, no container ports. Just ships, seasons, warehouses, animals, laborers, officials, merchants, contracts, storms, spoilage, and a population dense enough to become dangerous when the mills slowed. The physical contradiction is that Rome needed private market actors and feared them at the same time. Grain merchants, ship owners, warehouse operators, brokers, and transport networks were essential to survival. Yet any of them, at the right moment, could profit from scarcity. A delayed shipment raises prices. A hidden stockpile deepens panic. A rumor multiplies fear. A bad harvest becomes a political weapon if someone can control the visible supply. This is hunger arbitrage. The engineering problem was immense. Grain had to be harvested across provinces, purchased or requisitioned, shipped across dangerous seas, unloaded at ports such as Ostia or Puteoli, stored without catastrophic loss, transported inland, milled, distributed, and monitored. Every stage created a point where value could be extracted unofficially. A warehouse could underreport. A merchant could wait. A shipper could redirect. An official could be bribed. A broker could spread panic, then sell calm at a premium. Ancient people did not need modern finance to understand scarcity. They had stomachs. The political layer is why grain mattered more than luxury. Purple cloth could threaten symbols. Incense could enrich temples. Silk could reshape prestige. But grain touched the mass body of the city. Hunger turns private suffering into public motion. A crowd waiting for bread is not an economic abstraction. It is a referendum with teeth. The Annona was therefore welfare, logistics, imperial theater, and riot prevention compressed into one institution. The emperor's generosity had to appear material, not symbolic, edible. A ruler could lose battles and survive if the narrative was managed. Let bread fail in the capital, and the narrative begins managing itself. This is what made hoarding so politically sensitive. A grain merchant did not merely manipulate price. He approached the machinery of legitimacy. If the state promised food, but merchants could create scarcity, then imperial power depended on civilians it could not fully trust. If officials intervened too harshly, they risked disrupting the market they needed. If they intervened too weakly, they looked captured. The grain trade placed the state inside a permanent negotiation with private necessity. Who feared the black market? The urban poor feared hunger first. Officials feared riot second. Emperors feared the transformation of hunger into accusation. Honest merchants feared manipulators who could profit from panic. Dishonest merchants feared law only when enforcement became more profitable than bribery. The erasure comes through mockery. Bread and circuses reduces a serious food security system to a joke about pacified masses. It flatters the speaker, which is why the phrase has survived so well. It imagines Romans as easily bought by free grain and entertainment, as if feeding a million-person capital with pre-modern technology were a cheap trick. The joke skips the warehouses, ships, laws, import zones, public anxiety, and the fact that hungry crowds do not remain charming for long. The courtroom narrative now rises with a dry loaf in hand. Rome distributed grain to keep the people content. The grain dole pacified the urban poor. Merchants sometimes hoarded or manipulated supply, so the state punished abuses. Bread kept politics stable. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the harbor closes in a storm and the city begins counting days. Because food distribution was not merely pacification, it was infrastructure for survival. The Roman state was not tossing bread into the crowd like a magician distracting children. It was managing a megacity's dependence on maritime imports. If the system failed, Public order failed. If merchants gamed the system, legitimacy leaked. If officials overpromised, the queue became an indictment. Several cautious hypotheses fit the evidence. First, grain hoarding and price manipulation likely intensified during moments of shipment delay, war, harvest uncertainty, or political transition, when rumor increased the value of stockpiles. Second, black market grain probably moved through the same networks as legal grain, because the people best positioned to hide supply were already inside distribution. Third, accusations of grain manipulation may sometimes have served political purposes, turning wealthy food suppliers into convenient villains when the state needed to show control. That does not make the merchants innocent. It makes the system more interesting. Rome built a food machine so large that corruption became a predictable maintenance problem. When does a grain merchant become a criminal? When he hides supply, when he waits for a better price, or when the crowd becomes hungry enough for the state to redefine patience as sabotage? How much imperial power rested not on legions, but on ships arriving on time? And if a city's loyalty depends on bread, is the ruler loved, feared, or merely tolerated until the next distribution? Rome's grain market gives us the 9th rule of ancient black markets. The most dangerous commodity is the one ordinary people cannot stop needing. Luxury crime irritates the state. Hunger crime threatens to move the crowd. From silk, we return to the stomach. From imperial costume to edible legitimacy. But the final file pulls the lens back from a single commodity to the architecture behind all of them. Tomb gold, slaves, coins, pepper, salt, incense, purple, silk, and grain all enter the underground economy after power defines who may touch, move, sell, copy, wear, eat, or tax them. So we leave the bread queue and travel south to the Nile Delta, to a place that looks legal at first glance. A licensed port, a controlled opening, a polite doorway for foreign trade, which is exactly where the illegal border is born. Chapter 10, Naucratis, the licensed port and the birth of the illegal border. The final file opens at a legal doorway, and you stand in the Nile Delta where foreign ships do not simply arrive into freedom. They arrive into permission. The river moves slowly. Officials watch closely. Interpreters listen harder than they speak. Greek merchants from cities such as Miletus, Samos, and Aegina come looking for Egyptian wealth, grain, craft goods, prestige, and access to a civilization that has no interest in being accidentally absorbed by everyone with a sail. At the center stands Pharaoh Amasis II, managing a problem that every old state eventually recognizes. Foreign trade is useful. Foreigners are useful. Foreign influence is less useful when it starts wandering around unsupervised. So the state creates a place where contact can happen without becoming uncontrolled contact. Naucratis looks like openness. That is the trick. If this anomaly is verified, then the ancient black market does not begin with criminals sneaking through the dark. It begins earlier. At the moment a ruler defines the official entrance, the legal port creates the illegal border. The site is Naucratis, a Greek trading settlement in the Nile Delta. It developed in the 7th century BCE, often associated with around 630 BCE. It lay on the Canopix branch of the Nile, roughly 70 kilometers inland from later Alexandria. Greek participation involved multiple city-states, traditionally 12. Before Alexandria rose into the Great Mediterranean machine, Naucratis was the major recognized Greek commercial settlement in Egypt. Those metrics sound calm. They are not calm. A licensed trading settlement means the state has already made several decisions. Foreigners may trade here. Not everywhere. They may gather under supervision. Not freely across the whole country. Goods may move through authorized channels. Not through every village, dock, canal, and private arrangement an ambitious merchant might prefer. Interpreters, customs officials, port managers, local authorities, and royal policy all stand between desire and access. That is the physical contradiction. Naucratis was legal, but that is exactly why it belongs in the story of black markets. Illegality is not a natural substance found under rocks. It is manufactured by boundaries. Once the state says, trade belongs here, every transaction outside that framework begins to acquire a different smell. Suspicious, untaxed, unauthorized, economically creative. The engineering of control was subtle. Egypt did not need to ban foreign commerce outright. Bans are crude and often bad for revenue. Instead, a licensed port allowed the state to concentrate foreign merchants, monitor their behavior, collect dues, restrict movement, and benefit from exchange without surrendering the wider landscape. Amasis could welcome trade while containing it. This is an old administrative art. Open the gate, then make the gate the only legitimate opening. The Greek merchant sees opportunity. Egypt has wealth, grain, prestige, old institutions, and objects worth crossing the sea for. The Egyptian official sees risk. Foreign traders bring silver, goods, information, alliances, habits, gods, and the exhausting tendency to ask whether the rule applies to them specifically. The interpreter stands between worlds, translating words but also translating permission into possibility. A mistranslated sentence can become profit. A local arrangement can become leakage. A restricted trade can become an unofficial network the moment everyone realizes the official door has a queue. The political layer is border control before the modern border. Ancient states did not always draw lines on maps the way modern states do, but they understood controlled access. Ports, markets, roads, river crossings, temples, and warehouses could function as filters. The point was not isolation. The point was managed exposure. Naucratis tells us that cosmopolitan exchange often came with administrative teeth. Later history enjoys the image of Greeks and Egyptians meeting, trading, borrowing, blending, influencing, and exchanging culture in a bright Mediterranean haze. Some of that happened. Of course it did. Humans placed near money and novelty tend to become very interested in one another. But the administrative reality is colder. Who may trade? Where may they stand? Which goods may move? Who interprets? Who taxes? Who watches? Who reports? What happens if a merchant bypasses the recognized settlement and deals directly with local producers? At what point does ordinary trade become smuggling simply because it occurred in the wrong place? The erasure works by turning control into culture. We remember Naucratis as a point of contact between Greece and Egypt. We remember pottery, dedications, sanctuaries, merchants, and early globalization. We are less eager to dwell on the governing logic that made one authorized contact zone necessary. The museum label says exchange. The state file says surveillance with commercial benefits. Ancient globalization had paperwork. Naturally, the paperwork is the part museum labels tend to skip. The courtroom narrative now arrives with a map and a pleasant voice. Naucratis was a cosmopolitan trading settlement where Greeks and Egyptians interacted. It shows the openness of ancient commerce and the movement of culture across the Mediterranean. Merchants exchanged goods, ideas, artistic forms, and religious practices. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until someone asks why the exchange needed to be licensed in a specific place. Because if ancient peoples simply met and traded freely, Naucratis would be less revealing. Its importance lies precisely in the fact that commerce was channeled. The Egyptian state did not throw open the delta and invite every foreign ship to improvise. It defined a zone. That zone made some trade legitimate and other trade suspect. The black market is born in the shadow of that distinction. Several cautious hypotheses follow. First, licensing Naucratis likely encouraged unofficial trade outside the permitted framework, because merchants always compare official access with easier, cheaper, or quieter alternatives. Second, interpreters and intermediaries may have become powerful brokers at the edge of legality, controlling information as much as language. Third, the state's effort to manage Greek access suggests that foreign commerce was not just an economic opportunity, but a political exposure problem. No border is only a line. It is a pricing system. It decides which movement is cheap, which movement is costly, and which movement becomes criminal. What is illegality before a state defines legal access? If a merchant sells the same goods in the same country but outside the authorized port, has the moral quality of the act changed, or only its relationship to power? And when we call a controlled settlement cosmopolitan, are we describing openness or the careful management of contact by a state old enough to know that trade is never just trade? Naucratis gives us the 10th rule of ancient black markets, the official door, creates the back door. By licensing contact, Egypt made commerce visible, taxable, and governable. By doing so, it also created the logic of evasion. Every permitted route casts an unauthorized shadow. The final file is therefore not the strangest because it is the most violent. It is the strangest because it is the cleanest. No corpse stripped of gold. No pirate cargo. No plated coin. No smuggled pepper. Forbidden salt. Sacred resin. Illegal purple. Hidden silkworm. or hoarded grain. Just a port, a rule, a boundary, and that is enough. Because once power defines where trade is allowed to happen, the underground economy is already waiting nearby, not as an accident, but as a structural twin. The ancient world's black markets were not outside civilization. They were the shadow cast by civilization every time it tried to control desire, movement, value, survival, status, or contact. A licensed port in the Delta closes the pattern. The back door was never separate from the building. It was designed by the front door. Outro. The shadow cast by civilization. You have reached the end of the ledger, because your mind is trained to notice where the official story becomes too smooth. That is the useful suspicion. Not cynicism for decoration, not conspiracy as entertainment. A colder habit. Looking at the rule, then looking for the shadow it creates. Across these 10 files, the pattern is not subtle. Egypt buried royal wealth and created the technical class that could reopen eternity. Rome condemned pirates while consuming the human cargo their violence supplied. Coins carried imperial trust, so counterfeiters copied trust. Customs took a quarter, so merchants learned discretion. Han officials monopolized salt and iron, then discovered that survival dislikes paperwork. Incense rose toward heaven after passing through toll roads, guards, wells, and elite pricing. Purple became dangerous because hierarchy needed a costume. Silkworms became contraband because biology could break a luxury monopoly. Grain became political because hunger does not respect imperial branding. And Naucratis, the cleanest file, revealed the whole mechanism. Once power defines the legal door, the back door is born. So what were the black markets of the ancient world? They were not random stains on otherwise orderly civilizations. They were diagnostic shadows. They appeared wherever rulers tried to control value too tightly, tax movement too heavily, monopolize necessity, sanctify wealth, regulate symbols, or channel contact through approved gates. The black market was not always anti-civilization. Sometimes it was civilization responding to itself. This does not make the smugglers noble. Tomb robbers violated the dead, pirates enslaved the living, hoarders profited from hunger, counterfeiters poisoned trust. The underground economy could be brutal, predatory, and morally empty. But the official economy was not innocent merely because it owned the seal. A legal slave market is still a machine for processing humans. A state monopoly on salt is still a state placing survival under fiscal control. A licensed port is still a border disguised as hospitality. The ancient world becomes clearer when we stop asking whether black markets existed and start asking why they were so rational. Desire needed roots. Power built gates. The roots found cracks in the gates. If you made it this far, you are probably not satisfied with marble statues, clean timelines, and museum labels that say trade when the evidence says control. Good. Defend your theory in the comments. Argue the case. Identify the file that most clearly exposes the system. And subscribe to Minimal Histories, where civilization is treated less like a triumphal parade and more like a crime scene with excellent architecture. The final answer is simple but not comforting. The black markets of the ancient world were not outside the ancient world's great institutions. They were produced by them. Where priests stored gold, thieves found inventory. Where states taxed luxury, merchants found silence. Where emperors controlled symbols, cloth became suspicious. Where rulers licensed trade, illegality learned where to stand. The shadow was never separate from civilization, it was cast by the light.